Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 24. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're studying the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 24, the top 3 issues are the text and meaning of verse 4, the text, grammar, and meaning of verse 6, and the meaning of the gates and doors in verses 7 and 9. The first exegetical issue for Psalm 24 is the text and meaning of verse 4. We've translated this verse as, "One with clean hands and a pure heart, who hasn't delighted in falsehood, nor taken an oath deceitfully." The issue is in the second line of this verse, "who hasn't delighted in falsehood." The ESV translation gives a more literal rendering of the same Hebrew text, "who does not lift up his soul to what is false," which is another way of saying "who hasn't delighted in falsehood." The JPS 85 translation, on the other hand, has something very different. It says, "who has not taken a false oath by my life." Notice that where the ESV has "his soul" or "his life," the JPS 85 has "my life" with a capital M, indicating that the Lord is the speaker here. The JPS 85 translation is giving us a good translation of the Masoretic text, which says, "Esher lo nasa lashav nafshi," who has not lifted up my soul, nafshi, to what is false. Or as the JPS 85 interprets it, "who has not taken a false oath by my life." The difference between the JPS 85 translation and the ESV translation is the result of a single Hebrew letter, the very last letter in the line. Whereas the JPS 85 follows the Masoretic text in reading nafshi, my life, the ESV reads instead nafsho, his life. Although the best of our medieval Hebrew manuscripts, for example the Leningrad Codex, read nafshi, a number of other medieval Hebrew manuscripts read nafsho. Furthermore, all of the ancient versions have a third-person suffix here, which means that their Hebrew manuscripts probably read nafsho. In many Hebrew manuscripts, these two letters, yod and vav, nafshi, nafsho, look very similar, and they often get confused. So it's understandable why some manuscripts would have a yod and others would have a vav. The question for us then is, in which direction did the confusion happen? Did the earlier text have a vav, which then became a yod, or did the earlier text have a yod, which then became a vav? The evidence of the ancient versions, which are our earliest witnesses to the text of Psalm 24, support reading a vav, nafsho, his soul. The reading nafsho also makes the most sense within the context. The expression, "to lift one's soul to something or someone," is used elsewhere to describe desire for something or someone. For example, the very next psalm, Psalm 25, begins, "Elecha Adonai nafshi esa." "To you, O Lord, I lift my soul." That is, my desire is for you, Lord, and for no other. So in Psalm 24, verse 4, to say that the man does not lift up his soul to falsehood is to say that he does not delight in falsehood. And this understanding of the line works very well in the context of the verse. The following line talks about taking an oath deceitfully. By contrast, the reading "my soul" does not work as well in the context. According to this view, the Lord is the speaker, and "my soul" refers to the Lord's soul. So the Lord would be saying in this verse, "The one who can go up on my mountain is the one who hasn't lifted up my soul to what is false." The meaning might be similar to what we find in the Ten Commandments, where the Lord prohibits taking his name in vain, literally lifting up his name to falsehood or to vanity. But because the Lord is referred to in the third person throughout Psalm 24, and because there's no point in the psalm where the Lord is clearly introduced as a speaker, it seems unlikely that he's speaking here in verse 4. For these reasons, we've chosen to follow a majority of translations in reading nafsho instead of nafshi. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this view on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this view an A rating. The second issue for Psalm 24 concerns the text, grammar, and meaning of verse 6, probably the most difficult verse in the psalm. To illustrate the difficulty, consider two modern translations. The NIV says, "Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, God of Jacob." The KJV, on the other hand, says, "This is the generation of them that seek him, that seek thy face, O Jacob." Notice that where the NIV and others have God of Jacob, the KJV and others have only Jacob. This difference in translation reflects, like we saw in the previous issue, a difference in the text being translated. The Masoretic text reads, "Ze dor dorashav, mavakshe fanecha Yaakov Selah." And this is the text that the KJV and others have translated. It mentions only Jacob and not the God of Jacob. By contrast, the NIV and others are reading a Hebrew text that says not just Jacob, Yaakov, but God of Jacob, Elohei Yaakov. In support of this reading, the footnote for the NIV translation says, quote, "Two Hebrew manuscripts and Syriac. See also Septuagint. Most Hebrew manuscripts face Jacob." The two Hebrew manuscripts referred to in the NIV footnote are medieval manuscripts, and both of them read, "Fanecha Elohei Yaakov, your face, God of Jacob." The reference to Syriac is a reference to the ancient Syriac translation of the Bible, the Syriac Peshitta. This translation says, "This is the generation that seeks and waits in hope for the presence of your face, O God of Jacob." It seems likely that the Hebrew manuscript on which this Syriac translation was based would have included the word Elohei, like the two medieval manuscripts. The NIV footnote also says, see also Septuagint. The Septuagint says, "This is the generation of people who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob." The text here is similar to what we see in the two Hebrew manuscripts and in the Syriac Peshitta, all of which mention the God of Jacob. But the text of the Septuagint is also a little different in that it says, "face of the God of Jacob," instead of "your face, God of Jacob." The Hebrew text on which the Septuagint is based might have read, "Panei Elohei Yaakov," instead of "Panecha Elohei Yaakov." But it's also possible that the translators read a Hebrew text very similar to the Masoretic text, "Panecha Yaakov," and that they're simply doing their best to interpret it. For the sake of argument, however, we will grant that the parent text of the Septuagint included the word Elohei. And so the question for us is, which reading is earlier? The reading with Elohei or the reading without Elohei? The reading with Elohei, God, makes good sense in the context of Psalm 24. "Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, God of Jacob." And so if we read Elohei Yaakov, the God of Jacob, as the NIV has, then the verse is rather easy to understand and translate. If, however, we remove Elohei, then the verse is difficult to understand. It's not clear how the word Jacob is functioning in the sentence. At the same time, the relative ease provided by the reading Elohei casts some doubt on whether it is the earlier reading. In general, scribes were more likely to add to a text to make it easier to understand than to take away from a text and make it more difficult to understand. So it's easy to see why a scribe might have added the word Elohei. It's more difficult to see why a scribe would have omitted the word Elohei. For this reason, we've preferred to follow the reading of the Masoretic text, Panecha Yaakov, without the word Elohei. But now we have to try and make sense of the text. At first, the most natural reading seems to be Yaakov as a vocative, as the KJV has translated it, that seek thy face, O Jacob. Usually, when a name follows a second-person pronoun like this, it's a vocative. For example, Psalm 4 verse 8 says, "Nasa aleinu or panecha Adonai." Lift up on us the light of your face, Lord, where Adonai, Lord, is clearly a vocative. But if we read Psalm 24 in this way, then the pronoun your in the phrase your face would refer to Jacob, and then the line would be talking about people who seek Jacob's face. But the previous line has just mentioned those who seek the Lord, and there are other places in the Psalms that talk about seeking the Lord's face. Seeking the face of someone other than the Lord borders on blasphemy. In fact, the theological difficulty here could be the reason why scribes felt the need to add Elohei to the text in the first place. But there are other ways of understanding the syntactic function of Yaakov besides the vocative interpretation. The JPS 85 translation, for example, says, "Such is the circle of those who turn to him, Jacob, who seek your presence. According to this translation, Jacob is in apposition to the circle of those who turn to him and to who seek your presence. In other words, the text is being interpreted to mean, such is the generation of those who seek him. That is, the generation of those who seek your face. That is, the generation of Jacob. The reason why the JPS 85 translation has moved Jacob to the middle is probably just to avoid the misunderstanding that Jacob is a vocative. Another way of interpreting the syntax, which results in the same meaning, is to read generation of Jacob, Dor Yaakov, as a construct chain that has been broken apart across the two lines of the verse, something that happens occasionally in Hebrew poetry. According to this interpretation, we might translate the text, such is the generation, those seeking him, those who seek your face, of Jacob. That is, such is the generation of Jacob, those seeking him, those who seek your face. Whether one prefers to read the verse like this, with a broken construct chain, or with simple apposition, like the JPS 85, the meaning is basically the same. The verse is talking about what it means to be an Israelite, what it means to be Jacob, to be counted among those who seek the Lord. In conclusion, then, we've chosen to follow the Masoretic text for verse 6, and we've opted to interpret Jacob not as a vocative, but as co-referential with those who seek the Lord. We give this interpretation a B rating. The final exegetical issue for Psalm 24 is the meaning of gates and doors in verse 7 and verse 9. Verse 7 reads, "Lift up your heads, gates, and be lifted up, eternal doorways, so that the glorious King might enter." Verse 9 is almost identical. "Lift up your heads, gates, and lift up, eternal doorways, so that the glorious King might enter." Unlike the previous two exegetical issues for this psalm, there's no textual or syntactic uncertainty here. In terms of text and grammar, these verses are fairly straightforward. The issue here has to do with the larger question of what these verses mean. What does it mean to summon gates to lift their heads? What does it mean for eternal doorways to be lifted up? And what does this have to do with the rest of the psalm? Many commentators, and we would agree with this view, see the events of 2 Samuel 6 as the background for this psalm, the story where David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. The call for the gates to lift their heads, then, is related to the Lord's entrance into his new resting place. If we assume 2 Samuel 6 as the background, there's still a question as to whether the gates mentioned in this psalm are the gates of the temple or the gates of the city. The repetition of the word glory throughout verses 7 to 10 might suggest that the Lord is here entering his temple, the place most associated with his glory. But at the time when the events of 2 Samuel 6 took place, the temple had not yet been built. And although 2 Samuel 6 does say that the ark was brought into a tent, which might have been called a temple, it's not clear whether this tent would have had gates and doors. And even if it did, it would seem odd to describe them as ancient. It's more likely that verses 7 to 9 describe the Lord's entrance into the city of Jerusalem, which did have gates and doors, and whose gates and doors might rightly be described as ancient. Furthermore, the city of Jerusalem was mentioned earlier in Psalm 24. Verse 3 talks about the Lord's mountain and the Lord's holy place. Elsewhere in the Psalms, the holy mountain of the Lord refers to the city of Jerusalem, or Zion. Psalm 2, for example, says that the Lord has set his king on Zion, my holy mountain. What then does it mean for these city gates and doors to lift their heads and to be lifted up? Well, in one sense, there's a literal lifting which needed to take place in order to allow the ark to enter. As the text says, be lifted up so that the glorious King might enter. It could be that the phrase be lifted up or lift up in the B line of each verse refers to the lifting up and removal of the bar of the gate, the bar which would have locked it closed, which needed to be lifted in order for the gates to open. At the same time, however, the commands to lift your heads and be lifted up, especially the first of these, lift your heads, probably have a figurative meaning as well. In the Hebrew Bible, the gates of a city are sometimes mentioned as a way of referring to the people who are in the city gates. For example, Boaz says to Ruth, "The entire gate of my people knows that you are a woman of valor." By gate, he means, of course, the people in the gate. Furthermore, in Hebrew, lifting one's head is usually something that people do as a sign of confidence and hope. It's likely then that the gates in Psalm 24 are not just the physical gates of the city, but that they also stand for the people who are in or near those gates. And so, while the command for the gates to lift their heads and for the doorways to be lifted up may refer to something actually happening with the gates themselves that would allow the ark to enter, there's probably also a figurative meaning. The people at the city gates are summoned to lift their heads, to be glad and confident that their king has returned from battle in triumph. This joyful celebration at the entrance to Jerusalem as the ark enters the city is probably meant to point to something even greater. See, for example, how the Aramaic Targum of Psalms has understood these verses. In verse 7, the Targum says, "Lift up your heads, O gates, of the house of the sanctuary," understanding the gates here as literal gates, albeit of the temple instead of the city. But then in verse 9, the Targum says, "Lift up your heads, O gates, of the Garden of Eden." Throughout the Old Testament, the holy city of Zion and the temple within it are described in Edenic terms, and vice versa. The Garden of Eden in Genesis is presented as a kind of temple. And so it's no surprise that early Jewish interpreters would make this connection. What prompts the connection in this particular context is probably the creation language in the beginning of the psalm. Beginning in verse 1, the text says, "The earth and its fullness belong to the Lord, the world and the inhabitants in it, because he has founded it upon the sea and established it upon the ocean." When we continue to read the rest of the psalm within this cosmic framework of the Lord as creator, we're prompted to read the image at the end of the psalm of the Lord as a triumphant warrior king returning from battle in cosmic terms. The description of the Lord entering Jerusalem after defeating his enemies, based on the events in 2 Samuel 6, remind us of the greater reality of the Lord's conquest over chaos and his reigning from his heavenly temple. It also points forward to the time when the Lord will finally put an end to all chaos, enter his heavenly temple, and reign over his people forever. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. Verse 4 describes the kind of person who's able to stand in the Lord's presence. It's the person with clean hands and a pure heart, the person who has not delighted in falsehood or taken an oath deceitfully. Verse 6 goes on to say that this is what it means to be a true Israelite. Those who reject lies and deceit, who walk in the truth, these are the true Israel, the generation of Jacob. If verse 4 and verse 6 are about the people preparing to meet the Lord, verses 7 and 9 are about the Lord coming to meet his people. The Lord is returning from battle. Having conquered his enemies, he's now at the gates of Jerusalem. The people within the gates are summoned to lift their heads in confidence and hope, and the gates themselves are called to open so that the king can enter. And the picture of the ark entering Jerusalem and being received by an expectant people is not only an historical one. The image here is meant to point us both back to creation, when the Lord conquered chaos and entered his heavenly temple, and forward to the day when he will conquer all of his enemies and enter the new Jerusalem, the Garden of Eden, where he will be received by his hopeful people and sit on a throne forever. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 24, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our Poetic Features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.